So humans across all cultures coordinate movement in musical scenarios, and this coordination is often based on a specific kind of internal time reference called musical meter. So in this talk, I'll use the term meter to describe a perceptual representation that contains a nested set of periodic pulses. And here you can see an example meter in orange, which contains 4 pulse levels with different periods. And what I mean by a pulse is just a series of regularly recurring points in time. And so the listener uses these perceived metric pulses as an internal time reference to encode the timing of the incoming sounds and to produce precisely timed movement. Now, one of the key questions is, how does the brain establish and maintain a stable representation of periodic pulses from a complex acoustic signal that is often far from being strictly periodic? To learn about this mapping, we need a way to capture how prominently a particular set of metric pulses, the higher level perceptual category, is represented in the acoustic stimulus, in the elicited brain activity, and in induced movement. And so to do this, we've been developing a method based on frequency tagging. So a typical paradigm in our lab is that we take a stimulus based on a repeating rhythmic pattern of tones. Now, here the tones are arranged in a regular way to closely align with a set of periodic pulses, and here I'm showing one of them. And when we extract acoustic modulations in the stimulus and transform this to the frequency domain, we get a series of peaks which represent how the energy in the rhythmic sound fluctuations is distributed across different frequencies. Now, here is the EG response, which represents synchronized activity of large neuronal populations that we recorded from the scalp surface as participants were listening to the rhythm without any movement. And we can see peaks at the same frequencies as in the stimulus spectra just above that represent the activity elicited by the rhythm. Now, here in red is the meter that was most consistently perceived by participants when they were asked to tap along the rhythm in a separate session. There are multiple pulses in this meter, and each is defined by a particular period. Now, our approach is based on the fact that periodicity in a signal is reflected in its spectrum as prominent peaks of energy at frequencies corresponding to the period and harmonics. So based on the periods of these perceived metric pulses, we can tag the frequencies in the sound modulation spectrum as related to the perceived meter corresponding to pulse periods and the harmonics, and the rest of the frequencies can be tagged as meter unrelated. And then we quantify how much meter-related frequencies, here in red, stand out in the spectrum relative to meter-unrelated frequencies in blue. And here we see that they stand out a lot. So the periodic pulses from the perceived meter seem prominently represented in the physical structure of this stimulus. And when we look at the EG responses across individual participants, here in purple, we see that the meter-related frequencies are also more prominent than meter-unrelated frequencies. But of course, this can be explained here by just passive tracking of stimulus modulations by the brain. But let's say we take a different stimulus. For instance, the one here is based on a pattern that doesn't align very well with periodic pulses. Hence, we can call it, for example, weakly periodic, syncopated, irregular, or complex. And I'll just stick with the term complex here. And what's cool is that this rhythm also induces perception of a stable meter, as we can see when asking participants to tap along. However, notice that now the frequencies where participants consistently perceived metric pulses are not very prominent in the acoustic structure of this rhythm. Yet, meter-related frequencies are still prominent in the EG response, even though this cannot be directly explained by the sensory input. So instead of tracking the stimulus, the brain seems to selectively enhance the representation of periodicities where participants tend to perceive metric pulses. Now, here we were using kind of boring artificial stimuli made up of repeated tone beeps, but are we going to observe the same thing with real musical stimuli? Well, to test this, we took 2 instrumental electronic music tracks that people would actually listen and dance to in naturalistic scenarios. Here you can see the simulated firing rate fluctuations elicited by the music at the cochlear level. And while these 2 tracks are spectrotemporally complex, they're actually quite regular 4-on-the-floor tracks. And we took 2 additional tracks that were rhythmically complex, with a lot of syncopation and cross rhythm going on. And we had participants listen to these 4 tracks without movement while we recorded their brain activity with EEG. And we did this in 2 sessions on 2 separate days. And at the end, we had an additional session where we asked participants to tap the pulse they perceived in the tracks. So we'll start with the tapping data. We can look at the preferred intertap intervals separately for each participant. And we had a mix of people with and without musical training. And we see that the non-musicians are generally more variable, which becomes more obvious in the complex tracks. And because this electronic music was quantized, we could actually calculate periods of different plausible metric pulses for each track. And indeed, participants consistently tap pulse periods from a plausible and coherent metric set, except for this last complex track where some non-musicians seem to tap near intervals with a 3-to-4 ratio to the rest of the participants. And in fact, this music track involved a strong 3-to-4 cross rhythm, which seems to have confused these participants, and they couldn't really tap a regular pulse, which we can see by calculating the stability of each participant, of tapping of each participant with respect to their closest individual plausible metric periods. And while people generally perform very well, even for the complex tracks, there seems to be a bunch of participants that can't synchronize with a stable metric pulse, especially for this last track. Now here is the spectrum of the simulated early sound representation at the cochlear level. And as expected for the regular music tracks, there are large peaks at frequencies corresponding to the periods and harmonics of metric pulses that participants most often tapped. And here we see that similar peaks were elicited in the measured EEG response, suggesting that the brain is tracking the auditory input. And similarly to our results with artificial rhythms, meter-related frequencies are very prominent in the brain responses for these regular tracks. And each yellow line here is a participant. And this can be easily explained by low-level stimulus features as captured by the cochlear model, which is shown in black. And the responses were quite consistent in the second session. Now, for the first complex track, the stimulus didn't have prominent meter frequencies in its acoustic modulations, but the brain selectively amplified these periodicities in the first and in the second session. Now, here is the track where many participants struggled to perceive a stable meter. And unsurprisingly, the prominence of meter frequencies was super low in the sensory inputs. And while the brain response did significantly enhance this prominence, meter frequencies were still not standing out in the EEG responses. Interestingly, the brain seemed to enhance meter frequency slightly more in the second session, which we can see when we look at the relative prominence of meter frequencies like this. So here are the values for the cochlear model. And for the EEG response to the first regular track, session 1 versus session 2, and for the second regular track. And here the Z-score is above 0 for this first complex track, which says that meter-related frequencies were more prominent than meter-unrelated frequencies in the EEG responses, which was not the case for the last complex track, but it seems to get slightly better across the 2 sessions. So to quickly summarize, there seems to be a robust mapping between a sensory rhythmic input and an internal representation of meter, even when the input lacks prominent acoustic cues to metric pulses. And this is linked to a neural transformation, a sort of periodization of the sensory input, where metric pulses are selectively enhanced in the neural activity when they are not prominent in the physical structure of the stimulus. And this transformation takes place even for ecologically plausible but less controlled stimuli, which we can capture with frequency tagging. When the input is too complex, the transformation might not be sufficient, and we can link this kind of to overt movement abilities. And finally, the involved neural processes seem to be shaped by prior experience, seems like even passive exposure, especially for complex inputs, but we definitely need more work to further support this finding. So I'd like to thank my supervisors and collaborators and you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.